Hey guys, this is Mrs. Hannum. Today we're going to be going over adjacent and vertical angles. Our objective today is to identify adjacent and vertical angles, and we're also going to be finding angles measures using adjacent and vertical angles. So let's first start off with the vocabulary. Two angles are adjacent angles. Oops. When they share a common side and have the same vertex. So let's go through that one more time. Two angles are adjacent angles, meaning they're side by side, and they share a common side and have the same vertex. Let's look down at our example and maybe let's clarify some things. We have angles 1, 2, 3, and 4. Well, we know adjacent angles are side by side. Think of it almost as like your next door neighbor. They're right next door to you, or they're on the right side or the left side of your house. So, looking at our example, we could say angle 1 and angle 2 are adjacent. We can also say that angle 3 and 4 are adjacent. But our next part asks, what angles are not adjacent? Well, if you look at angle 2 and angle 3, they are not next door to each other or side by side. So they can be considered not adjacent. Let's look at our next part. It says two angles are, this part would be vertical. Vertical angles, when they are opposite angles formed by the intersection of two lines. Vertical angles are congruent. Meaning they have the same measure. In geometry, instead of saying equal, we say congruent. So in the parenthesis, put equal. So let's go through that one more time. Two angles are vertical angles when they are opposite angles. Key word there is opposite, formed by the intersection of two lines. Vertical angles are congruent, meaning equal, and that means they have the same measure. Let's look at our example below. We have angles 5, 6, 7, and 8. Our question asks, what two angles are considered vertical angles? Well, looking back at your definition, you know that they are formed by the intersection of two lines, and they are opposite from one another. So looking at our example, angle 5 and angle 7 are considered vertical angles. We can also say that angle 8 and angle 6 are also considered vertical. Okay, so there we have it. Angle 5 and angle 7 are vertical angles, as well as angle 8 and angle 6. Okay, this next section asks us to name angles, and we're going to use the figure to the right to help us with our first question. It says, name a pair of adjacent angles. Well, if you look back through your vocab notes, you know adjacent angles share a common side as well as a vertex. And they're thought to be considered your next door neighbor because they're side by side angles. So let's look at our figure. Angle ABC and angle ABF are considered adjacent angles. I highlighted our angles so that you'd be able to see where they share a common side and a common vertex. Let's look at the next part. We need to name a pair of vertical angles. Remember, vertical angles form at the intersection of two lines, and they are opposite angles. Angle ABF and angle CBD are considered vertical angles. I just highlighted our vertical angles so you can see where they're opposite from one another. So there's our vertical angles. Okay, our next part says to tell whether the angles are adjacent or vertical, and then it asks us to find the value of x. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit so we can see A. Okay, so part A, we see our one angle measures 135 degrees. And then we have an angle right next to it, which we don't know yet, but it's x. Looking at these two angles, they are next door to one another. So what type of angles are they? Are they adjacent or vertical? If you said adjacent angles, you're correct. And we figure out that the degree measurement of x is 45 degrees. 135 degrees plus 45 degrees would give us an answer of 180. Some of you may be wondering how I got an answer of 180 when I add the two up. If you remember what you previously learned, straight angles are equal 180 degrees. So if I took the angle measure of 135 degrees, if I took this angle, and I also took the value of x, these two angles together would form a straight line. And we remember a straight angle is 180 degrees. Let's look at part B. Part B has two lines that intersect, and we have two angles that are opposite from one another. Intersection of two lines and opposite angles would give you vertical angles. So there it is. Part B are vertical angles, and x is 105 degrees. We know that with vertical angles, our angles are congruent, meaning equal. All right, let's look at our last question, or our last example. It has an angle measure of 27 degrees, and there's not an x in there, so Mrs. Hannum is going to put that right in there. There we go. So we have 27 degrees, and we have an angle right next door to us. So what is it? Vertical or adjacent? If you guessed adjacent, you're correct. Good job. So there we have it. Part C is adjacent angles, and x is 153 degrees. Because remember, those two angles together form a straight angle, which equals 180 degrees. So 153 degrees plus 27 degrees gives you 180. Now looking at C, you could tell too that our angle of x is greater than 90 degrees. So remember that too. So that angle measurement is greater than 90. So it's called an obtuse angle. Alright guys, this last section is called the U-Try. I'm going to ask that you copy down these 3 questions. Make sure you include the diagrams and also the directions and answer them. Tomorrow we're going to go over them first thing in class. Good luck. See you soon.